Welcome to another edition of Chips and Salsa. I'm Jerry.
I'm CRob.
And CRob, we got a good show today. From the Intel side, we have Vincent Zimmer, who is our industry firmware security expert. He's been doing this for years and years. And our special guest is Alex Matrosov from Binarly, who folks may know. They're very active in the community and doing some great research. And let's cut to these guys and have a chat. Well, welcome to the show, Alex and Vincent. Glad to have you here. We'd like to have you guys give us a little bit about who you are and what you do. Alex, why don't we start with you?
Hello, Jerry. Thank you for having me on this podcast. And I'm Alex Matrosov. I'm doing security research probably forever and finding a lot of vulnerabilities. But finding vulnerabilities, it's a good thing. But another thing, you need to actually help the industry to fix it. And it's another part of my job.
Excellent.
Right on.
Hi, I'm Vincent Zimmer. I've been doing BIOS host firmware for a couple decades. I lead some of the efforts in the industry on what we standardize, firmware security in the UEFI forum, work with the open source, and then work with Intel and some of the ecosystems around best practices around firmware.
Frequent viewers of our podcast will remember Vincent. He came and talked to us in Chips and Salsa episode 5, which was forever ago.
Yeah, so between the two of you guys, you obviously have a lot of years of experience working in this segment of the industry. So today we're here to talk about what are some of the biggest threats to firmware security in the industry today, and what are some of the more prevalent types of firmware attacks? Alex, why don't we
I think the biggest threats against the firmware security, not only it is a supply chain, right? So basically, when the vendors releasing the fix, it's a good thing, but also how this fix get applied on endpoint devices, it's another. And specifically when actual fix or vulnerability get fixed in some sort of a reference code or generic code of the library, which is get used on different firmwares, that's create a lot of effort in supply chain to actually fix it. And sometimes such vulnerabilities can stay kind of forever because it's take a while to fix all the devices which can be potentially affected.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and Vincent, from an Intel perspective, what have you seen over the last couple of years?
Yeah, I concur with Alex. The supply chain is really challenging, and we build reference code that we provide to customers for our various systems on a chip. And then we work with open source communities on the latest capabilities that are in standards, updates against the latest issues. But that sort of diffusion of open source and reference code through equipment manufacturers, ODMs, OEMs, patches maybe curated, but are then users actually patching. These are some of the challenges. And then the fact that this source code moves to the supply chain and be re-permuted, different configuration options, build options. There's rarely a single source of truth of the binary hash. And so it's not so simple to say, hey, do you have the latest DXE core hash 1234 if you do some introspection on a endpoint machine. So the richness and variability of the ecosystem, and then the timing at which patches are applied and ingested is definitely one of the challenges we've observed the last several years.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's a lot of sense on what is actually Vincent been saying, and also as example, sometimes what happen, let's look on some of the issues of in EDK, not in EDK2, but let's say some of IBVs, they can modify EDK2, right? And then basically it's not became the whole ecosystem problem, but single IBV vendor problem when this modification can cause some of the vulnerabilities, but it's not exist in the mainstream code. And here's another thing, when you actually fork mainstream part of the open source reference code from silicon vendor, so you need to support it. All the changes need to be upstream from master to your own fork. And I think it's kind of like it can create additional supply chain problems, and probably like the changes in common libraries with an open source, it's kind of like not the best idea in terms of the designing security.
From either your observations, Vincent, or your research, Alex, do you have a feel for kind of what the average time is from when an update or a fix is pushed upstream to the time it's ingested downstream with consumers? Just to kind of give us an idea of the scope.
So I can give some feedback, maybe a little old. We've done a lot of coordination with the standards and open source, and we've heard from equipment manufacturers. Mm-hmm. And they originally said, hey, give us a patch and such that we'd have maybe a year to diffuse through our fleet. Some mm-hmm. models, they may only patch a couple times a year. And then you counterpoint that with Google Project Zero mm-hmm. and the 90-day, strict window. So a couple years back, they were asking for a year. I think things have gotten better. So maybe 6 months. But again, a lot of vendors don't, do a monthly update of a BIOS, for example, like you may see in operating system patch frequency. So, 3 to 6 months is probably a representative timeline of what I've seen demonstrated in the market.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Anything to add, Alex?
I agree with Vincent. Actually, for firmware security fixes, it's take a while, right? And sometimes it's like a pretty positive timelines with a 3 to 4 months. Sometimes it goes to 6, 9, or even like beyond the year when it goes with some pretty serious ecosystem problem, right?
What are some of the common attacks that we see against firmware in the industry now?
It's actually a great question, because if we compare what we're seeing right now in the wild, basically it's kind of outdated attacks. And let's take pretty recent examples like a Cosmic Trends and Mosaic Regressor. It's like a Chinese APT groups which has been operating from 2014, 2015. So it's literally goes beyond the 7 years of persistence in the wild, right? So it's kind of crazy we're just detecting it right now, and we've not seen that 5 or 7 years ago.
Yeah, no, I think one of the things we've definitely observed is BIOS is really just like another class of system software. So, people who've, were attacking Windows and Linux a decade ago can sort of dust off some of their attack techniques. And so, applying, so, we looked at kind of the statistics. So some of the advocates of Rust today are saying, hey, 70% of kernel issues and Windows issues are sort of memory pointer safety. Integer overflows and stuff. In our world, we looked, that's about half, and then the other half are sort of semantic issues, meaning did I set some lock register or appropriately program some configuration? So, firmware, since it is just another class of system software, a lot of the suite of attacks, and luckily mitigations, can be reused. And then there's a unique set of capabilities or attacks, that are unique to firmware, how we boot and lock down the machine, or how we configure the different assets. So, one of the things we definitely try to do is work with the community to say, let's at least catch up to some of the state of the art. Are we doing, stack protection, execute protect, using the SDL, code analyzers, and then at the same time, maybe some purpose-built tools like ChipSec, which can assess your platform to say, hey, did you program this specific SOC appropriately, assert the lock registers and such. So I guess the answer is things you'd expect to see afflicting operating systems or a class of attacks, and then it's a class of attacks that are very unique to the domain of a host firmware.
Is a ChipSec tool available to all customers, or?
Yes, it's on GitHub. So github.com/chipsec, and it's Python, and you can run it in the pre-operating system, say from the UEFI shell or from the operating system.
Alex,
ChipSec is a pretty handy tool for actually extracting the firmware and doing some of the forensics. Also, like it's a lot of other tools available, which is helping to identify exactly the details of the changes inside the firmware. For example, EFI Explorer, IDA Pro plugin, or like a firmware hunt rules can actually go to beyond the semantics to detect actually some of the specific vulnerable patterns or threats. But anyway, so what I wanted to highlight, actually, I completely agree with Vincent. UEFI firmware became whole real-time operating system nowadays, right? Like if you look on the source code, this goes beyond 6 million lines of code nowadays. It's actually bigger than CentOS kernel. And so we have such complexity into the firmware, which of course will cause some of the gaps in security. It's impossible to build very complex system like that and don't have any attack vectors on it, right?
Mm-hmm. So both you, Alex, and Vincent mentioned a couple tools. Is there anything customers can do to protect themselves with these kind of new threats?
So I think it's very good and very difficult question at the same time. So first of all, going with any of these tools, you need to have some level of expertise, right? So basically you need to kind of understand what you are doing with the chipsec to get the data and indicators you wanted to extract and look for, right? Also, chipsec, it's give you an ability to extract the data, but all the decisions and analysis you need to actually proceed yourself. And the same thing about UEFI Explorer as an IDA Pro plugin. It's help you to analyze the code in UEFI firmware. But if you basically don't understand what you're looking for, probably you will be not find it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'd advocate definitely for end users because, as Alex said, the domain of firmware is there's definitely some obscurantist details. So best practices like patching, applying patches, BIOS updates from your vendor. And in the old dark days, we used to have DOS boot floppies with Flash utilities, but now the update experience has been pretty optimized. So Windows Update actually can orchestrate providing a BIOS update. So in EFI, we have something called a capsule, which is a sort of a named update file that leverages some of the infrastructure Windows Update has. And luckily, the Linux community has embraced it. So Richard used the Linux verification firmware service, LVFS, is kind of like a peer to Windows Update. So a manufacturer can curate one update, and then LVFS can orchestrate launching and applying it on a Linux class machine. And Windows Update can take that same payload and update a Windows machine. And to the end users, the experience is similar to applying other OS patches. So, having, working with getting your vendor updates and having them applied in a timely fashion, I think is really key because, that's probably your best line of defense. But even more sophistication of an IT pro or something using some of the emergent tools, the IDA Pro plugins and other things are definitely valuable, but I think for end users, the best bet is applying patching best practices.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think automatic updates, right?
Automatic update, yeah.
I think that's very important to actually keep your firmware up to date. And unfortunately, not always it's being consistent delivery for the firmware updates, right? So right now, Microsoft is actually working with big vendors such Dell, HP, for Intel NUCs, and they own Surfaces to deliver consistently the updates when it is released. But not all the vendors actually available for this update delivery. And also if it goes to the server ecosystem, it's complete wild west in terms of the patching if you look on the data centers. And in the same time, we have very interesting project called Linux Firmware Volumes, LVFS, right? So which is actually stand for keep up to date the Linux machines, right? So that's very important project for ecosystem and actually driven by Linux Foundation and Red Hat. I think that's quite important to mention here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was trying to find Windows Update on my Fedora box, and I was having trouble. I was going to have Jerry come over and type it in.
You didn't see that little Windows icon there?
Didn't.
This is what the video edit button is for.
Back to the question, if you have the most recent update, does it is not contain any vulnerabilities, at least for a week? That's actually a very difficult question to answer, because without actually getting into code analysis, you can't understand what exactly get patched, what is not. And I think trust but verify, it's always important to keep supply chain consistent and actually fixes at the place applied.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we need some sort of a Jedi sword to fight such threats, right? So basically then we can magically solve these problems.
All IT pros will now be Jedi. So, do you guys see more security researchers focusing on firmware these days? I know, Alex, your company, you guys do some security research, look for vulnerabilities in firmware, but just in general, are we seeing more of that these days than we have in the past?
I think that's a very good question. In general, I think attention for firmware security gets much more attractive nowadays. Specifically, like NIST mentioned that firmware it became critical piece of software, and it's need a special assessment in these terms. And as well, companies like Intel, they driving bug bounties more focused on the hardware and firmware security. And that's actually very great initiative when researchers, which is actually even don't have an experience, can start something with. They can collaborate with Intel teams and learn something to actually dive deeper in that space. I think that's actually a great initiative. I've been a part one of the first programs called Camping with Tigers. It's been focused on the Tiger Lake, and it's been very positive experience. Actually, it's been a bunch of the researchers, and it's a lot of communications on the Slack channel. And actually, vendor been driving some interesting presentation about the products, and actually this motivation of actually give the people right tools to find the more deeper and obscure bugs. It's actually pretty cool. I really like that.
Nice.
Yeah, so good plug for Project Circuit Breaker, which is a brother program for camping with tigers, which, I think the thing you pointed out is, at Intel, we're trying to educate more, people who are really good at security research. Maybe they've been focusing on software for a long time, how the firmware in our product is supposed to work, and get, like you said, giving them the tools to go and try to break it. So nice. Yeah, it's cool. It's a cool project. I guess so. Alex, we don't want to give away anything about your talk next week at Black Hat, but we're going to see you there to talk about your talk. Any final thoughts from you, Alex, on this topic of the state of firmware security in the industry?
Yeah, just one more shoot out for supply chain, and I think one of the most recent discoveries from the Binarly team has been a firmware bleed, and actually it is related to some of the mitigations which has been developed by Intel quite a while ago, but the industry time of adoption, it's actually been different from the time of development of the mitigations. And I think it's come to some inconsistency of supply chain. Basically, it should be a trust, but you need to have an ability to validate and understand if these mitigations work properly, if it is mitigations actually get used. And I think the tools like ChipSec and others, which is Binarly developing as well, it's actually helping the industry to recover from these repeatable failures.
Yeah, I think we also, see cases where and this is something we talk about at Intel a lot, especially on this podcast, is the level of investment and security assurance and the level of maturity of your processes. We're trying to bring everybody along with us as we, work to mature our own, processes around vulnerability management. But I think that's a big deal in the industry right now, is trying to get everybody, up to a better speed on, their capability and, managing these things. So Vincent, any final words from you?
No, I think I agree with all those points, and I actually appreciate the opportunity to engage with the community and do shout outs to some of the work we're trying to do to, like you said, raise that acumen. We have some best practices documents on coding on our TNO Core website. Some of the insights from Alex helps really drive, urgency, and then maybe novel ways we can assess our mitigations. And so, yeah, I really think just continue. It's a journey. And so, again, technology, there is no technology silver bullet, but I think working as a community and then continuing to raise the bar of, again, the acumen of developers, and then, learning from the researchers as we go along. And that's probably been my last thoughts on the matter.
Excellent. Well, we're really looking forward to the talk next week at Black Hat, and talking to you afterwards, Alex. And I think we want to thank you both for taking your time to share this very interesting and incredibly important topic with our audience.
Thank you for having us. It's been a fun podcast. Thank you, guys.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunities. Yeah, really appreciate it.
Wow, Jerry, that was really neat. It's such a timely topic too, really.
Yeah, I think it was good. Great insights from both these guys, and also encourage folks to go back and look at episode 5 of Chips and Salsa, where Vincent and Brian Richardson from Intel discussed firmware protection technologies that customers should make sure they have enabled. That's a good one to go back and watch.
Indeed. And Alex touched on our Camping with Tigers program. Again, it's talking about the maturity and investment into the ecosystem and trying to uplift our research partners. And I'm really excited to see his talk at Black Hat.
Yeah, me too. So again, CRob and I will be at Black Hat Wednesday and Thursday, August 10th and 11th. And we'll be at the booth at various points. So come by and see if you can find us, and maybe we'll interview you for an upcoming Chips and Salsa.
And we might have some swag. And
some swag.
I think with that, we're going to call this show a wrap. Thanks to everybody, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thank you.